Zagorski on, a Packers and NFL historian and author, and a member of the Pro Football Historical Association. So we're going to go to break, and we're going to see Dylan back for our new segment on Tuesday. And when we come back, we'll have our guest. Thanks a lot, Dylan.
I'm looking
and we
forward
will see
to having
you,
him on.
yes, on Tuesday.
Hey, thank you guys very much.
Have a good one, Busby.
I've been grinding so long, been trying this shit for years. And I got nothing to show, just climbing this rope right here. And if there's a man upstairs, he kept bringing me rain. But I've been sending up prayers and something's changed. I think I finally found my hallelujah. I've been waiting for this moment all my life. Now all my dreams are coming true, yeah. I've been waiting for this moment. It's good to be alive right about now.
Yes, it is good to be alive right about now, and we are now joined by our very special guest, Joe Zagorski, who says his name is very Irish. Hi, Joe.
Hey, hi guys, how's it going?
We are doing
I am
wonderful.
doing great.
and I'm so glad we could get you on. We're going to get right to it because we got just a little bit less than 30 minutes because we went a little long on our first segment. So I want
No
you
problem.
right away introduce yourself and brag yourself up. This is your time to brag yourself up and tell everybody what you're up to, Joe.
Joe Zagorski time.
Okay, well, first of all, I'm not running for president, so you won't see me at any debates.
I'm still going to write you in.
No, that'd be a waste of your vote. My first book on the NFL in the 1970s came out in 2016. Many years ago, I kind of enjoyed watching football as a kid, as I guess a lot of people do. And I always thought, the 1970s was an incredible decade. Okay, and I thought, wouldn't it be great if I could write a book about that sort of thing? So I did it in little bits and pieces here and there and whatnot. And then I guess it was in 2012 or 2014. I can't remember which. I met a publisher, McFarland and Company, and over in Canton, Ohio, at the Hall of Fame. And we were there for a Pro Football Researchers Association business meeting. And, I told this guy, hi, wondering what type of books are you looking for? And he asked me what I was working on, and I told him, his name, by the way, is Mark Durr. And he said, well, you're working on a book on the 70s in pro football. We just recently published a book on the 70s in pro baseball, Major League Baseball. Would you like to send us something that you have just to see if we could, have it, possibly published with our company? And I thought, well, why not? What's going to hurt, So I sent him a few chapters, and it didn't take long for them to get back in touch with me, telling me that they wanted to publish it. So that's when I went into full research mode, and I started researching all the 70s. And long story short, it took about 6 years till I could finish the book totally. And it came out in 2016. it's done really well. I didn't really expect to have that kind of an audience that yearned for remembering a decade that happened 40 some years ago. But it sold over 1,600 copies, so I was pretty impressed by that. And it just kind of cemented my reasoning that the 70s was a great decade. Now, fast forward a couple of years after that, I got the idea to write a book about the 1972 Green Bay Packers. Well, the 72 Packers were the only Packers team in the 70s to win a division title or to go to the playoffs. So I knew there was something going on there. It was a special team, I thought. I remember watching them as a kid. And, I started to interview some of the players from back at that time. And it turned out that it was an incredible story. My first book on the 70s and the NFL, it was, a comprehensive year-by-year look at that whole decade. But the story of the 72 Packers was unique because most of the players, in fact, almost every one that I interviewed, they didn't get along too well with their head coach at that time, Dan Devine. And Dan Devine, I never met him or anything like that. I never had a chance to interview him before he passed away. So all I had to go on was the opinions of, the Packer players who played for him. And it seemed like that the Packers were not just going up against their weekly opponents on Sunday afternoons, but on several occasions they were going up against their head coach. A lot of the players basically surmised that Dan Devine was not really cut out to be an NFL head coach. He had come to the Packers from the University of Missouri, and he did pretty well at University of Missouri. And a lot of the Packer players that I interviewed, they said that he probably should have stayed, in the college ranks. So that's pretty much the friction that happened throughout 1972. Yes, the Packers won that division, the NFC Central, it was called at that time, the old black and blue division. But they did it because there was a lot of teamwork and a lot of chemistry on that team to play in that sort of a situation where your head coach can really bring you down on certain occasions. Devine would often, from what I've been heard from other players, would often put the team down instead of building them up and inspiring them. And it all came to a head at the end of the year. They won their division, and they're going to play the Washington Redskins in the playoff game. And on the eve of the playoff game, Dan Devine, who had turned over the reins of coaching pretty much to Bart Starr and to Dave Hanner, offense and defense respectively, decided that Dan Devine was going to resume coaching and calling plays on the eve of the playoff game at Washington. Long story short, they lose that game because Devine was not willing to go to an audible system with his quarterback, Scott Hunter. The Redskins put 5 men on the their defensive line, shutting down the prize glory of the Packers of 72, their running game. And short passes here and there would have forced the Redskins to get out of that 5-man line. And but Devine was, he was cement rock hard. He wasn't going to. He's very stubborn. So that book on the 72 Packers is more of an opinionated book. It's I'm listening to a lot of the players who were there at the time and finding out that their journey throughout that season was similar one to the other. They were all pretty much, they had a great team chemistry, but they had to, because their coach wasn't really a part of that chemistry. He was kind of like an absolving agent against it. So now, and I also recently finished a book on the first African American middle linebacker in pro football history, the great Willie Lanier out of the Kansas City Chiefs. So that book and the Packers of 72 book, they're both hopefully going to be out before Christmas this year. So that's what I've been.
I'm gonna have to get me a copy.
Those actually, I will tell you this. I'm a relatively considered a young guy, and so is Dave. I am 36. I believe Dave is younger than that yet, and yet I find it fascinating. Yeah, I find it fascinating of the history of the game, especially the 70s era and what we as Packer fans call the void years, which brings me to this point, Joe. I have to ask you this. I listened to a program on ESPN radio called Wilde and Tausch with Packers Hall of Famer Mark Tauscher and the beat writer Jason Wilde. They had a discussion today, and the topic of Lynn Dickey was brought up. And they got into this discussion that they need to have a documentary on him. And I thought, what better person to talk to about Lynn Dickey, who we don't know a lot about in his
Joe
years,
Zagorski.
than you?
Well, you guys are too kind. But my knowledge of Dickey isn't. I mean, I know a little bit about him. For one thing, he was one of the most injured quarterbacks of that decade in the 1970s. Every time you turned around, you would find out that Dickey was spent a lot of time on injured reserve. He had a great arm. Came into the league, I believe, in '71 with Dan Pastorini, and they were both drafted by the Houston Oilers at that time. And Dickey was a journeyman, though. After he played with the Oilers, he eventually found his way into Green Bay, and he was kind of like I'm going to say kind of like John Elway-esque in some form or fashion, because he had a really great arm, but he had a lot of potential. He's very strong-minded, kind of like Dan Fouts. Lynn Dickey could call his own plays, and he could handle pressure very well. But the injuries really hurt his opportunities later on to get into the Hall of Fame, unfortunately. He had some of his better years, though, into the early 80s. I believe it was him who led the Packers into that 82 playoff game versus the St. Louis Cardinals. That was a strike year, by the way. That could have been him. You see, once I get past 79, I have a hard time remembering, and I'm sure your listeners will say, no, that wasn't him. But Lynn Dickey was a very good quarterback. Doesn't get a lot of attention today because of another quarterback that came into Green Bay quite a few years later, Brett Favre. Have you heard of that guy?
Yeah,
no, actually, I've never heard of that guy actually at all. I don't know who the heck he is. Is he good?
He did pretty well for himself, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. I guess from what it seems like Dave thinks, he must have been a pretty good guy.
Yeah, he was okay.
I never got a chance to meet Brett Favre, but I don't know if there was too many other players in pro football, even today, that had as strong of a right arm, throwing arm as he did. I mean, he could put balls into spaces that he kind of reminds me of Patrick Mahomes of the Chiefs now. He had the same kind of an arm that Favre did, but he was a bigger guy too. So.
Actually, Baker reminds me a lot of Favre's will and tenacity, like his fun on the field and stuff like that. He reminds me a lot of Favre with that.
Yeah, hey, he's going to be if he stays injury free, he's going to be a heck of a quarterback. Especially if the Browns use him right, and try not to confuse him too much with too many things. I think he has a promising future. If I was a Cleveland Browns fan, I'd be excited.
They have one of the most talented rosters I've seen in a long time on paper. And I'm not saying they're going to come out and do anything, but I have a lot of hope for them. With Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham Jr. having previous time playing with each other in college, now joining back up on a professional team, getting a young QB with a good arm and the will and the fun to play football. Like and plus the running backs, alone. You get Nick Chubb and Duke Johnson, and then you get Hunt to come in after his suspension. Like, that's a three-headed monster running game, if anything, and one of my biggest underrated. Huh?
Well, and there's a good mixture there of guys that are not really old, but they're still veterans, and they have some savvy, some knowledge, and the youngsters. Really good mixture.
Yeah, and their defense is surprisingly got now outside linebackers the edge guys. Sorry, the edge guys are Myles Garrett and Olivier Vernon. Oh God, that's a very nice matchup for pass rush.